In moments of national consequence, history rarely announces itself with spectacle. More often, it reveals itself quietly, in a hearing room, behind a microphone, in a clipped exchange between an elected official and a cabinet secretary. What determines whether such moments fade into obscurity or endure as warning signs is not volume, but substance. And in this case, substance was impossible to ignore. When Congressman Alexander Vindman asked Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth a simple question, "Do you owe a military mother an apology?" he was not merely engaging in political theater. He was testing the most fundamental principle of military leadership, accountability. The refusal that followed did not just answer Vindman's question. It exposed a fracture, one that runs between lived military experience and the political power now sitting atop the Pentagon. To understand why this exchange matters, it is essential to move past the viral clip and into the deeper reality it represents. This was not a confrontation manufactured for headlines. It was a collision between two cultures, one defined by rigid discipline, shared risk, and operational humility, the other increasingly shaped by optics, deflection, and personal insulation from consequence. Alexander Vindman does not speak from abstraction. He speaks from a career forged inside the U.S. military system, a system that does not reward improvisation when lives are at stake. Vindman's credibility does not come from partisan alignment, but from immersion in the very rules and norms that Secretary Hegseth is charged with overseeing. That distinction matters, because the questions Vindman asked were not traps. They were benchmarks. From the outset, the hearing revealed a troubling dynamic. Vindman's line of questioning was methodical, structured, and grounded in unclassified Department of Defense assessments. He did not demand classified disclosures. He did not seek sensational revelations. Instead, he asked the Secretary of Defense to demonstrate familiarity with the strategic realities currently shaping U.S. military planning. The Indo-Pacific timeline, China's naval expansion, NATO's vulnerabilities in Eastern Europe, and the evolving character warfare as revealed in Ukraine. These are not obscure data points buried in classified annexes. They are foundational facts, briefed openly to Congress, allies, and the public. When the Secretary struggled to answer them, the issue was not memory. It was preparation. And when preparation falters at the top, consequences do not remain abstract. But it was not the missed numbers alone that unsettled observers. It was a pattern. Each deflection, each generality, each refusal to engage directly suggested a deeper discomfort with accountability itself. The questions were not hypothetical. They were rooted in the present. China's Navy is already the largest in the world. The 2027 readiness benchmark is not speculative. It is a public acknowledgement of a narrowing strategic window. The Suwalki Gap is not a trivia question. It is one of NATO's most dangerous flashpoints. Yet the hearing's most consequential moment did not revolve around ships' corridors or timelines. It revolved around a mother of an F/A-18 pilot who flew a real mission over the Red Sea, a mother who accepted, as military families are forced to do, that she would not know where her son was deploying or when he would return. A mother who understood that secrecy is part of service, that silence is not cruelty, but protection. Vindman did not invoke her lightly. He had spoken with her. He had listened. What she expressed was not partisan anger. It was disbelief. Disbelief that her son was held to a stricter operational security standard than the civilian leader responsible for the entire force. This is where the hearing crossed from political critique into moral reckoning. Operational security, OPSEC, is not an optional guideline in the U.S. military. It is drilled into service members from the moment they enter uniform. Even seemingly trivial details, timing, confirmation, movement, are treated as potential vulnerabilities. This is why pilots cannot tell their families where they're going, why units compartmentalize information, why mistakes involving communications are treated with gravity, regardless of outcome. Success does not excuse recklessness. Survival does not absolve error. That principle is taught at the lowest levels because the consequences of ignoring it are paid in blood. Against that backdrop, the revelation that aspects of a live military operation were discussed in an unofficial signal chat was not a minor lapse. It represented a breach of the very discipline imposed on those carrying out the mission. When Vindman relayed the mother's request, not for punishment, not even for resignation, but for an apology, he was asking the secretary to acknowledge that asymmetry. An apology in military culture is not weakness. It is recognition. It is a first step in restoring trust when authority has been misused or standards unevenly applied. Leaders who admit fault are not diminished. They are believed. Accountability, when modeled at the top, reinforces discipline throughout the chain of command. Hegseth's response, "I don't apologize for success," was therefore not merely inadequate. It was revealing. By framing the issue as outcome-based, the secretary dismissed the process entirely. But military ethics do not operate on post hoc justification. A mission success does not retroactively legitimize protocol violations. If it did, every unsafe shortcut would be acceptable as long as catastrophe was avoided. Near misses would become non-events. Lessons would go unlearned. Vindman understood this, which is why his follow-up landed with such force. Even privates are trained to do better. That statement was not rhetorical cruelty. It was an indictment of a leadership standard that appears to stop precisely where authority begins. What made this moment resonate was not outrage. It was recognition. Service members watching did not need Vindman to explain why it mattered. Families did not need pundits to translate the stakes. They saw a familiar imbalance. Responsibility without power below, power without consequence above. This is a danger when civilian control of the military becomes detached from military culture itself. Civilian leadership is not meant to dilute standards. It is meant to uphold them with legitimacy. That legitimacy depends on respect for systems designed to protect lives, not on dismissing them when inconvenient. Segment 1, then, is not about a single refusal or a single hearing. It is about a signal, one that echoes far beyond the room in which it was sent. A signal about what kind of accountability exists at the highest levels of defense leadership, and whether the burdens borne by those in uniform are still matched by those who command them. Because when accountability fails at the top, discipline erodes below. And when discipline erodes, the cost is never theoretical. It is paid by real people in real cockpits over real combat zones, while their families wait in enforced silence, trusting that those in charge are honoring the same rules they demand others obey. To understand why Alexander Vindman's questions carried such weight, one must understand the culture he comes from, and the culture that was being implicitly dismissed. The United States military is not merely an institution of force. It is an institution of discipline. Its effectiveness does not come from technology alone, but from habits ingrained so deeply that they become instinct. Among those habits, none is more foundational than operational security or OPSEC. OPSEC is not a bureaucratic checkbox. It is a mindset. It is the assumption that any piece of information, no matter how small, can become lethal when combined with other fragments. It is the discipline of restraint in an age of constant communication, and it is enforced relentlessly because history has shown again and again that wars are not lost only through grand strategic failures, but through small, careless disclosures. From the first days of basic training, service members are taught that what they say, when they say it, and to whom they say it can have consequences far beyond their immediate surroundings. They are trained to assume that adversaries are always listening, always watching, always correlating. A casual confirmation, a timing detail, a location hint. These are not harmless facts. They are puzzle pieces. This culture exists because it has been paid for in blood. The U.S. military's institutional memory is long. It remembers when troop movements were intercepted by radio chatter, when ships were targeted because patterns were predictable, when pilots were lost because timelines were exposed. Every generation inherits those lessons, often without needing to know the specific names or dates. The rule survives because the cost of violating it has been proven too many times. That is why pilots cannot tell their spouses where they are deploying, why parents are given vague answers, why families learn to live with uncertainty. This silence is not imposed because the military is indifferent to families. It is imposed because the alternative is risk. Vindman understands this not as theory, but as lived reality. His career placed him inside the machinery where decisions translate directly into movement, exposure, and vulnerability. When he speaks about OPSEC, he is not reciting doctrine. He is invoking a shared code. That code is not flexible depending on rank. In fact, the higher one rises, the stricter the expectation becomes. Junior service members are disciplined for lapses not because they are careless, but because they are learning. Senior leaders are held to higher standards precisely because their words carry greater weight and wider reach. When a private violates OPSEC, the damage is limited. When a Secretary of Defense does, the damage is systemic. This is a context in which the signal chat controversy cannot be brushed aside as informal communication. In military culture, unofficial does not mean safe. If anything, it means the opposite. Unsecured, non-standard communication channels are treated with suspicion precisely because they lack institutional safeguards. Vindman's framing was deliberate. He did not accuse Hegseth of malicious intent. He did not suggest treason or sabotage. He focused instead on standards, on whether the Secretary of Defense understood and respected the same rules imposed on those executing his orders. This distinction matters. Military culture is not obsessed with intent. It is obsessed with outcome and risk. You can violate OPSEC without intending harm. The violation is still real. The risk is still introduced. The accountability still applies. That is why Vindman's reference to privates struck such a nerve. It was not an insult. It was a reminder of proportionality. Privates are taught OPSEC early because mistakes at scale are intolerable. If those at the bottom are expected to internalize discipline immediately, those at the top are expected to embody it flawlessly. Inside the military, this principle is non-negotiable. Rank does not shield one from standards. It magnifies responsibility. What troubled many observers within the defense community was not simply Hegseth's refusal to apologize, but his apparent inability or unwillingness to engage with his framework at all. By reframing the issue as a matter of mission success, he revealed a worldview more aligned with political survivability than military ethics. Success, in military terms, is never binary. A mission can succeed tactically while still exposing flaws operationally. In fact, post-mission analysis exists precisely to identify such flaws before they become fatal. After-action reviews are brutal by design. They do not exist to assign blame, but to surface truth. No commander worth respecting hides behind outcomes to avoid scrutiny of process. To do so would undermine the very learning culture that keeps units alive. Vindman's insistence on accountability was therefore not exceptional. It was orthodox. It reflected the expectation that leaders acknowledge mistakes openly so systems can improve. This expectation is drilled into officers and NCOs alike. Leaders who deflect responsibility are not trusted. Leaders who own errors are. The response, "I don't apologize for success," violates this norm at its core. It suggests that as long as the result is favorable, the method is irrelevant. That logic is antithetical to military professionalism. Imagine a junior officer justifying a safety violation by pointing to a successful outcome. Imagine a pilot disregarding procedure and later claiming vindication because no one was hurt. That argument would not survive 5 minutes in a debrief. The officer would be corrected, counseled, or removed. The reason is simple. Luck is not a strategy. Vindman's intervention forced this uncomfortable truth into the open. It exposed a gap between how military leaders are trained to think and how political appointees sometimes operate. That gap becomes dangerous when political authority overrides professional norms without understanding them. The culture divide was visible not just in the answers, but in the posture. Vindman's questions were precise, grounded, and cumulative. He was building a case, not for scandal, but for concern. Each missed answer, each deflection, reinforced the impression that the Secretary was not operating from the same knowledge base as those he commands. This is not a matter of personal intelligence. It is a matter of immersion. Defense leadership requires constant engagement with evolving threats, doctrines, and lessons learned from active conflicts. Ukraine's drone warfare is not an academic case study. It is rewriting the rules of modern combat in real time. Failure to internalize those lessons is not theoretical. It has future consequences for U.S. service members. When Vindman pointed out that no U.S. service has fully standardized FPV drone integration, despite their dominance on modern battlefields, he was highlighting institutional lag. But the subtext was sharper. Awareness without action is negligence. Inside the military, such lag would trigger urgent review. Leaders would be expected to explain not just what they know, but what they are doing about it. That expectation did not appear to be met. The emotional core of the exchange, however, remained the mother. Military families are not abstractions in policy debates. They live with a unique burden. They surrender information in exchange for trust. They trust that the system holding their loved ones to silence is itself disciplined. Vindman gave voice to that breach. He did not dramatize it. He presented it plainly. A mother asked for an apology, not vengeance, not spectacle. Recognition. Recognition is the currency of military sacrifice. It is how institutions signal that burdens are shared, not imposed. An apology would not have endangered national security. It would not have undermined authority. It would have affirmed that leadership understands the weight of its own actions. The refusal communicated the opposite. This is why the exchange resonated far beyond partisan lines. Service members and veterans watching did not see a political clash. They saw a cultural mismatch. One side spoke the language of responsibility, learned through consequence. The other spoke the language of optics, learned through power. And in the military, culture is not cosmetic. It is operational. When leaders fail to respect OPSEC norms publicly, it sends a message privately. It tells subordinates that standards are conditional, that accountability is negotiable, that hierarchy protects some while exposing others. Such messages do not need to be explicit to be effective. They travel informally, through conversations, through mess halls, through quiet disillusionment. Over time, they corrode trust. Vindman's insistence on accountability was an attempt to arrest that corrosion. He was not merely addressing Hegseth. He was signaling to service members and families that someone inside the system still recognizes their reality. This is why Segment 2 matters, because it reframes a hearing not as a confrontation, but as a cultural audit. It asks whether civilian leadership still understands the institution it commands, or whether it's drifting away from the norms that make military power sustainable. The answer to that question does not emerge from a single apology or refusal. It emerges from patterns. And in this case, the pattern revealed a troubling distance between authority and accountability. Operational security is not negotiable. It is not situational. It is not erased by success. It exists precisely because success is never guaranteed. When leaders forget this, they do not just risk missions. They risk the trust that binds a force together. And once that trust erodes, no amount of rhetoric can restore it. There's a reason Alexander Vindman's questioning shifted so deliberately from operational security to strategic competence. The two are inseparable. Discipline without knowledge is rigidity. Knowledge without discipline is recklessness. Military leadership requires both, exercised continuously, under pressure and without excuse. What Vindman exposed in this hearing was not a single lapse, but a pattern, one that suggests preparedness has become performative rather than substantive. The distinction is not semantic. It is the difference between leadership that reassures and leadership that actually protects. At the highest levels of defense, facts are not trivia. They are tools. They guide force posture, budget allocation, alliance commitments, and deterrence credibility. When a Secretary of Defense demonstrates unfamiliarity with widely available unclassified assessments, it sends a signal, not just to Congress or the public, but to adversaries and allies alike. The Indo-Pacific was not raised casually. It is the central theater of U.S. strategic planning in the 21st century. For years, the Department of Defense has publicly acknowledged that the balance of power in the region is tightening. China's military modernization, naval expansion, and explicit timelines regarding Taiwan are not speculative. They are documented. This is why the year 2027 matters. It is not a prediction of war. It is a planning benchmark, one that shapes readiness targets, procurement timelines, and joint force integration. When Vindman asked what year the Navy has publicly set as a benchmark for being ready to fight a war with China, he was not asking for secrets. He was asking whether the Secretary of Defense was conversant in his own department's planning assumptions. The deflection that followed, couched in generalities about readiness right now, missed the point entirely. Military readiness is not a slogan. It is measured against specific scenarios, timelines, and capabilities. Saying we need to be ready now is politically comforting but strategically empty. Vindman's correction, stating plainly that the year is 2027, was not adversarial. It was corrective. It underscored a growing concern that the Secretary was reacting rather than operating from prepared strategic framework. The same pattern repeated with China's naval strength. China's Navy is not just growing. It has already surpassed the U.S. Navy in sheer numbers. This is not classified. It is a fact acknowledged in unclassified Department of Defense reports and discussed openly in congressional hearings, think tanks, and allied briefings. When asked how many warships China fields today, the Secretary's answer, many and growing, was not wrong, but it was insufficient. At that level, insufficiency is failure. Leaders at the top are expected to carry these numbers instinctively because they shape everything from shipbuilding plans to alliance burden sharing. Vindman provided the number, approximately 370. He then asked how many ships the U.S. Navy has today. Again, the response drifted toward budgetary optimism rather than factual clarity. The correct number, 296, had to be supplied by the questioner. This exchange matters not because the Secretary missed a quiz, but because it revealed how he processes strategic reality. In military leadership, clarity precedes confidence. Leaders do not reassure their way out of capability gaps. They confront them. The question about China's projected fleet size by 2030 followed the same trajectory. The number, around 435, has been publicly reported. It is not speculative. It is part of a trend line that informs urgency across the defense enterprise. The refusal to engage with these figures, despite their unclassified status, suggested either unfamiliarity or avoidance. Neither is acceptable. Strategic competence is not about memorization. It is about fluency. Leaders must internalize the operating environment so thoroughly that responses are immediate, precise, and grounded. This is especially true when addressing Congress, whose constitutional role includes oversight of military readiness. But Vindman's questioning did not stop in the Pacific. He moved deliberately to Europe. The Suwalki Gap is not a niche geographic detail. It is one of NATO's most vulnerable corridors, a narrow stretch of land connecting Poland and Lithuania, flanked by Belarus and Russia's heavily militarized Kaliningrad exclave. It is widely recognized as a potential flashpoint in any NATO-Russia conflict. This corridor matters because it is the land bridge linking the Baltic states to the rest of NATO. Its vulnerability has been studied, war-gamed, and publicly discussed for years. Reinforcing it quickly in a crisis is a core planning challenge for U.S. and allied forces. When Vindman asked which corridor in eastern Poland is a priority for U.S. reinforcements, he was again probing foundational knowledge. The Secretary's inability to answer directly and his visible irritation at what he characterized as a quiz game revealed a misunderstanding of the exchange itself. This was not a game. It was an assessment. Vindman then identified the corridor himself and followed up with a second question. Which Russian territory, heavily militarized and nuclear-capable, borders the Suwalki Gap? The answer, Kaliningrad, was supplied only after further prompting. These details are not academic. Kaliningrad's missile systems, including nuclear-capable assets, are central to NATO's deterrence calculations. Any serious defense leader must understand not only where flashpoints are, but why they matter. Dismissiveness in this context is not a personality flaw. It is a leadership liability. Vindman's next pivot, to drone warfare in Ukraine, was perhaps the most revealing. Unlike theoretical future conflicts, Ukraine is a live laboratory of modern warfare. It has demonstrated in real time how low-cost, rapidly produced technologies can reshape the battlefield. First-person view, FPV. Drones now account for a staggering percentage of frontline casualties, over 70% by some estimates. This is not conjecture. It is observed reality, shaping tactics daily. When Vindman asked what percentage of Ukrainian frontline casualties are caused by FPV drones, the Secretary responded vaguely, acknowledging a very large percentage. Again, not incorrect, but again insufficient. The follow-up question cut deeper. Which U.S. service has written doctrine or standardized procurement for integrating FPV drones? The assumption, reasonable, optimistic, might be that at least one service has moved decisively. The reality, as Vindman pointed out, is that none have fully done so. This is not a small oversight. It is a warning sign. Military history is replete with examples of institutions failing to adapt quickly enough to changes in warfare. Cavalry clinging to horses. Battleships dominating budgets after aircraft carriers proved decisive. Static defenses overtaken by maneuver warfare. Ukraine's drone revolution is not a future trend. It is happening now. Failure to internalize and act on these lessons places future U.S. service members at risk. Vindman's critique here was not accusatory. It was urgent. He was highlighting a gap between observation and implementation, between watching and learning. At the Secretary of Defense level, awareness without action is not neutral. It is a choice. What ties all of these exchanges together is not embarrassment. It is exposure. Exposure of a leadership style that prioritizes rhetorical confidence over demonstrated mastery. Exposure of a gap between the seriousness of the role and the depth of engagement with its demands. Competence at this level is not about being the smartest person in the room. It is about respecting the complexity of the mission enough to prepare relentlessly. It is about knowing that adversaries do not care about messaging. They care about capability. China does not assess U.S. readiness based on press statements. Russia does not calculate NATO deterrence based on tone. They assess based on posture, planning coherence, and leadership credibility. When a Secretary of Defense appears unfamiliar with publicly documented strategic realities, it invites miscalculation. And miscalculation is how wars start. Vindman's frustration, visible as the hearing progressed, was not performative. It was professional. He was confronting a pattern that suggested the gravity of the job was not being matched by the rigor required to execute it. This is why his critique carried weight even among those who may disagree with him politically. The questions he asked were the questions professionals expect leaders to answer. Military families, service members, and allies watching this exchange were not counting points. They were listening for reassurance, not the kind offered by slogans, but the kind earned through competence. What they heard instead was deflection, irritation, and a narrowing of responsibility to outcomes alone. That narrowing is dangerous, because preparedness is not measured after the fact. It is measured before the first shot is fired. Leadership at the Pentagon is not about winning arguments. It is about preventing catastrophes. It is about anticipating failure and closing gaps before adversaries exploit them. Vindman's interrogation, taken as a whole, functioned as a stress test, and what it revealed was not resilience, but fragility. Not fragility of the institution, but fragility of the leadership currently entrusted with it. That is why Segment 3 matters, because it shifts the focus from a single controversial chat to a broader question. Is the Department of Defense being led by someone who fully inhabits the strategic reality of the moment? If the answer is uncertain, the consequences are not theoretical. They are deferred, but only until the next crisis makes them unavoidable. Every leadership crisis has a moment when recovery is still possible, a moment when humility can arrest damage, when acknowledgement can restore trust, when authority can be strengthened rather than weakened. In the exchange between Alexander Vindman and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, that moment arrived in the form of a single, unambiguous question. Do you think you owe her an apology? It was not a trap. It was not an ambush. It was an off-ramp. Vindman did not demand resignation at that point. He did not accuse the Secretary of criminal wrongdoing. He did not frame the issue in partisan terms. He asked whether the civilian leader of the U.S. military could recognize the fear of a mother whose son was placed at risk, not by enemy action, but by leadership's own choices. That distinction matters. Military ethics are not outcome-based. They are responsibility-based. A leader is accountable not only for what happens, but for what they introduce into the system as risk. This is why apologies in military culture are not performative gestures. They are acknowledgments of obligation. Vindman's question was rooted in that ethic. It was an invitation to demonstrate that civilian authority over the military still respects the norms that govern military life. The mother Vindman referenced did not ask for punishment. She did not seek public spectacle. She asked for recognition. Recognition that her son was required to observe a discipline that his superiors appeared to disregard. recognition that the fear she felt was legitimate, not inconvenient. For military families, fear is not abstract. It is lived daily, in the absence of information, in the enforced silence that protects missions but isolates loved ones. Families accept that silence because they believe the system enforcing it is disciplined, consistent, and fair. An apology would have affirmed that belief. Instead, the response, "I don't apologize for success," close the door. This was not simply a refusal. It was a reframing. It transformed a question about accountability into a declaration of immunity. It suggested that success absolves process, that favorable outcomes erase responsibility for risk. In military leadership, this logic is not just flawed, it is disqualifying. Success in combat is never proof of correctness. It is often a product of skill, discipline, and courage operating alongside chance. Leaders are trained to separate these elements precisely because mistaking luck for competence leads to disaster. That is why post-mission analysis exists. That is why, after action, reviews dissect even successful operations. That is why commanders routinely say, "We got lucky here. Next time we might not." Hegseth's response rejected that ethos entirely. By invoking success as a shield, he implicitly dismissed the idea that his actions could have introduced unnecessary risk. He treated the outcome as validation rather than relief. In doing so, he inverted the moral hierarchy of command. Vindman recognized this immediately. His follow-up was pointed but measured. He acknowledged the bravery and professionalism of the pilots. He agreed that the mission itself was executed magnificently. Then he brought the focus back where it belonged, on leadership responsibility. The performance of subordinates does not absolve the errors of superiors. In fact, it heightens them. Military leaders are entrusted with authority precisely because others act on their decisions. When subordinates succeed despite flawed guidance or unnecessary risk, the leader's obligation to acknowledge that risk increases, not decreases. Vindman's insistence, "Are you going to be accountable?" was not rhetorical. It was the core of the exchange. Accountability in the military is not optional. It is the glue that holds the chain of command together. Orders are followed not because they are perfect, but because they are issued within a system where responsibility is owned. When that ownership disappears at the top, the system fractures. Hegseth's continued refusal to apologize, even when framed as a matter of respect for a military family, sent a clear message. Accountability flows downward, not upward. That message is corrosive. Vindman articulated this plainly when he noted that even privates are trained to do better. That statement was not meant to humiliate. It was meant to remind. Privates are trained to protect information, to respect protocol, to understand that shortcuts endanger lives. If they fail, they are corrected. What happens when those at the top refuse correction? The answer is erosion. Erosion of trust. Erosion of discipline. Erosion of moral authority. Leadership in the military is not sustained by rank alone. It is sustained by credibility. Credibility is earned when leaders demonstrate that they are bound by the same rules, often more strictly, than those they command. An apology would not have undermined authority. It would have strengthened it. It would have demonstrated that leadership understands its obligations extend beyond political survival. Instead, the refusal hardened perceptions that authority was being exercised without humility. This moment also revealed a deeper misunderstanding of civilian control of the military. Civilian leadership is not designed to override military norms. It is designed to integrate democratic accountability with professional expertise. When civilian leaders dismiss military ethics as inconveniences, they weaken both sides of that equation. They alienate the force while eroding the legitimacy of civilian oversight. Vindman's final words in exchange, stating plainly that Hegseth should resign, came only after every off-ramp had been closed. That recommendation did not arise from a single misstep. It emerged from a pattern. Factual gaps, cultural dismissiveness, and ultimately, a refusal to accept responsibility. The mother's request for an apology was the last test. It was the simplest one. It required no classified disclosure, no strategic brilliance, no political risk beyond humility. That test was failed. What makes this failure significant is not personal animus. It is precedent. When senior leaders normalize the idea that success excuses recklessness, they set a standard that others will follow, explicitly or implicitly. Junior leaders take cues from the top. They learn what is rewarded, what is punished, and what is ignored. If accountability stops at the secretary, it will eventually stop elsewhere. This is why military professionals reacted so strongly to this exchange. They recognized the stakes immediately. They understood that this was not about one signal chat, but about whether leadership still respects a discipline that keeps people alive. Vindman's invocation of the mother was not emotional manipulation. It was ethical grounding. Military families are the silent stakeholders in every decision. They bear the cost of risk without having any control over it. Acknowledging their fear is not weakness. It is leadership. The refusal to do so revealed something far more troubling than a communications lapse. It revealed a worldview in which authority is insulated from consequence, and empathy is treated as expendable. That worldview has no place at the top of the Pentagon. Segment 4 matters because it captures the moment when leadership could have course-corrected and chose not to. It shows how easily trust can be lost, and how difficult it is to rebuild once dismissed. An apology would not have changed the past, but it could have shaped the future. Instead, the opportunity passed, leaving behind a question far larger than any single hearing. If leaders cannot acknowledge risk when no harm occurs, will they accept responsibility when it does? Civilian control of the military is one of the defining features of American democracy. It is a principle designed not to weaken the armed forces, but to legitimize them. It ensures that military power remains accountable to the public, subordinate to elected leadership, and constrained by law. But civilian control is not synonymous with civilian disregard. It is not a license to ignore military culture, ethics, or institutional memory. When civilian leaders fail to respect the norms that govern military life, civilian control does not become stronger. It becomes brittle. This is the deeper issue exposed by the exchange between Alexander Vindman and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. The problem is not that a civilian sits atop the Pentagon. That is both necessary and constitutional. The problem is what happens when that civilian authority operates without the trust of the institution it commands. Trust in the military is not ideological. It is practical. Service members follow orders because they believe those orders emerge from a system that values their lives, understands their risks, and applies standards consistently. When that belief weakens, discipline remains, but commitment erodes. This erosion does not announce itself loudly. It manifests quietly in lower morale, in cynicism, in the sense that sacrifice is unevenly distributed. Over time, it undermines effectiveness. Vindman's intervention forced this reality into the open. By invoking a military mother, he anchored the discussion in the human cost of leadership decisions. Military families are not symbolic accessories to patriotism. They are participants in national defense, bearing emotional and psychological burdens that rarely receive sustained attention. Families accept these burdens because they believe the institution their loved ones serve is serious, about security, about discipline, about responsibility. When senior leaders appear exempt from the same constraints, that belief fractures. Civilian leaders often underestimate how closely service members and families observe their behavior. Words spoken in hearings are not confined to Washington. They travel through bases, through units, through family networks. They shape perception long after the cameras stop.